Dobry wieczór, Irlandi. So recently I was speaking to a Russian friend who I used to work with back in my days as a lawyer, and he reminded me that a couple of years back I had speculated that the foreign policies of Vladimir Putin would eventually lead to the collapse of Russia, at least Russia ceasing to exist in its current borders, a bit like what happened to the Soviet Union. And today is day 100 of Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine, the invasion that started on February 24th, 2022. And I'm going to react to, well, at least a few clips from a video that was sent to me yesterday by another friend who had been living in Ukraine also before this invasion and had to leave as a result. There's an interview where a Russian political scientist speculates the same thing and expects how this will come about in the next 3 to 5 years. So let's go in to the video and see, do we think Russia will collapse like the Soviet Union? Поехали.
Tsar Experience.
One political scientist and journalist has taken a different view. His name is Sergei Sumleny. He is Russian-born but lives in Berlin. And he said recently on Twitter, and I'm reading this out, "I think Russia will disappear or shrink to a Muscovy part, which is the same. We will see 10 to 15 independent states on the current territory of Russian Federation within the next 3 to 5 years, but most probably earlier." So he, in other words, says the opposite might happen. And instead of Russia taking on additional territory, it might actually start to break up.
So there we have the prediction by this political scientist, Sergei Sumleny, who I've also seen on Twitter. Actually, I've seen many of his tweets during this current war that's taking place. So there you have it. It's going to collapse a little bit like the Soviet Union did and split out into different independent countries. So let's see how he comes to that conclusion.
The Soviet Union had been killed by a chain of unfortunate events which used to occur in the same time. It was the last Afghan war with 15,000 killed in action soldiers within 10 years. We have currently 17,000 Russian killed in action soldiers within only 1 month. It was the economic crisis, and we have currently economic crisis in Russia. And it was a very old and very incapable government of the Soviet Union. Like Gorbachev was just like the young exemption who had been put on the top of the communist elite by other older guys because they realized that they are all too old to save the country.
So there he outlines 3 main similarities in terms of conditions between the Soviet Union and its collapse and what we see in Ukraine, I was going to say in Ukraine today, but in Russia today. And that is that it's basically run as a gerontocracy, basically run by old people, that you have a disastrous war that's taking place in terms of casualties for Russia and the Soviet Union back then, and it has severe economic problems. So let's look at all 3 of those. I noticed when Vladimir Putin gave his speech on May 9th that the backdrop with the people around him definitely did give off that vibe of being kind of not just that they were old, but they were also very backward looking. They were looking at the past all the time with, obviously May 9th is about the victory of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany in the Great Patriotic War from 1941 to 1945. So they celebrate that on May 9th every year, and it's still a big event in Russia. It's less so here in the West. We don't celebrate defeating the Nazis to the same extent as the Russians do. He has been, over the last year or so, when I've seen him give interviews, been talking a lot about history, also in his speech where he basically declared that he was going to go into Ukraine, and even more than he had in since 2014. So it would have been about 2 days before the February 24th invasion. And he was talking about, history from back when the Soviet Union was founded, and, history going back hundreds of years, and really talking about living in somewhere in the 19th or 20th century. And he's surrounded by these people who look about a similar age to him. Vladimir Putin is almost 70 years of age. So definitely in terms of that, yes, it looks more like a gerontocracy, government run by old people, especially when you compare that to the Ukrainian government, that Zelensky is in his 40s, so that makes him almost 30 years younger, he's 25 years younger, I guess, than Vladimir Putin, and many members of his team, they look noticeably younger, and they're more, I would say, forward-looking to the future, what Ukraine could become, and not looking so much at the past. So, yeah, that point definitely makes sense to me. The war in Ukraine on day 100, like he says, the fatality rate, the KIA, was 17,000 for the Russian forces in Ukraine since February 24th, about 1 month in. I would say, that seems to be probably relying on the Ukrainian government's figures, which, considering it's a war and not just a physical war, it's also a propaganda war, I would take them with a big pinch of salt that Russia lost that many soldiers at that point. But probably it's somewhere between 15 and 20,000 killed in action, and that is absolutely enormous. Historically, if we look, with the exception of the Second World War, obviously, where 27 million Soviet citizens died in total, the fact that more soldiers have died, Russian soldiers have died than Soviet soldiers did in almost 10 years of a war in Afghanistan, is definitely a bad omen for Russia. Now, on top of that, the Soviet Union had to leave Afghanistan. I think that's also an important point to mention. Russia, obviously, when I'm speaking, hasn't left Ukraine. They currently control 20% of de jure Ukrainian territories. That's legal Ukrainian territories. That includes Crimea, the parts of Donbass that they controlled, or they had the separatist republics, or occupied, depending on the word you want to use, before February 24th, since 2014, and the newly acquired occupied territories, which are mainly in Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Kharkiv Oblast, along with those in Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk. So they haven't had to leave Ukraine as yet. And they haven't obviously conquered all of Ukraine yet, or controlled it all either. So Ukraine still controls 80% of its territory. The last one is economic conditions. There's obviously a deep economic malaise in the Soviet Union towards the end of its history as being a state. And before this war, I think real incomes in Russia had dropped consistently over the last decade, really since 2014, when Putin decided to annex Crimea and start the first series of these invasions of Ukraine, also the wars in Donbass. And part of that is probably because the economic sanctions that were imposed by the West, that compared to the sanctions that have been imposed since February 24th, quite light. So you would expect over time for those economic sanctions to work. That doesn't necessarily mean that Russia's economy will decrease like the Soviet Union's face the same malaise. I mean, there are lots of things that can happen in terms of it selling its resources elsewhere, and obviously price for all these resources have gone up as well. So definitely they're feeling economic pain when I look at what our YouTubers are showing from the situation on the ground in Russia. So maybe there is a similarity in that, but we have to see what the long-term consequences economic are for Russia. It's a bit too early to say right now, but it's definitely been in, maybe not a complete economic malaise, but it's definitely had economic problems for most of the last decade, I would see. The first decade of Vladimir Putin's rule was matched also with a lot faster economic growth, especially up to 2008. And there was a financial crisis in 2008, obviously. So there you have three conditions, even if they are analogous, they're not perfectly analogous. And I guess a lot of this theory that he's going to outline in the video, and I'll drop a link to the video down below if you want to go watch it all, because this thing is about 30 minutes and I'm only taking a few clips out of it here. I think, the fact that the war is still going on is probably one of the main things that's different with the Soviet Union. Let's go and look at another clip.
All the resource-rich regions in Russia are ethnically dominated. You have oil in Tatarstan, you have oil in Bashkortostan, you have gas in Yakutia, you have diamonds in Yakutia, you have fish in Pacific region territories. You don't have anything of that in Moscow. Like Moscow produces nothing what Russia sells abroad. It is all being produced in ethnic-dominated republics, and they will start to think, why do we produce money for Moscow? Why do our kids die for Moscow? But why Moscow budget is higher than the budget of any region, and the budget of like 10 or 20 next rich regions is lower than the budget of Moscow.
So in brief, he predicts that the schism will start in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, where there are a lot of Bashkirs and where there are a lot of Tatars, and also in the Komi Republic. So they're the three areas, and they're not so far away. I mean, Russia is the biggest country in the world. It's absolutely massive. So he thinks the fissures will start there. And also that in the Far East, places like the Jewish Autonomous Oblast and Khabarovsk will be the regions that will be most likely to look for independence, basically, in such a scenario where Russia was to split apart. Now, it's not the only option they would have. It's basically about resource, let's say, financial redistribution, right? Because at the moment, the resources are taken out of different regions of Russia. They're sold abroad, and basically a disproportionate amount of the money then goes to Russia. Overwhelming disproportionate money, massively disproportionate. And, those regions might say, hey, why is not money coming to us? Now, you do have that also incentive in a lot of other parts of Europe. For example, we take Catalonia, for example, in Spain, a lot of the separatists move there. One of their arguments is, well, we'd be a lot richer if we weren't sending the money to other regions in Spain, right, that are poorer than Catalonia. So this is definitely something that is a massive incentive for a change in the structure, because in Russia, basically, bulk of the money is funneled to Moscow, but as he points out, Moscow doesn't actually really produce anything. It's where the money is basically divvied up and given out to people who have the right connections or in the right position to acquire those resources. So the relative poverty in a lot of the regions that produce a lot of Russia as well will be a massive incentive for them to definitely change the structure, if not just declare independence and keep the money for themselves. No need to finance everything in Moscow. He also says that some of these regions have like a separate identity that's kind of, I guess, there at the moment in conjunction with a Russian identity, like being Tatar, like being Bashkir, like being Komi. And that will come to the fore on top of these economic incentives to split away from Moscow once central power has weakened. So what are the effects of this for Russia if it were to happen? Let's see what he says about that.
But let me just ask, which of these 85 regions are you from originally?
I'm from Moscow region.
So you're not going to be...
I'm from Moscow suburb.
I see. So you wouldn't be part of this new broken...
Well, if I were like nowadays a Russian who lives in Russia, like my income would shrink. Yes, because I believe that the region which will suffer the most will be central Russia against Moscow, around Moscow. Because, for example, the western Russia around Petersburg, they will find their ways to join the EU that way or another, maybe association, but they will find their way. Central Russia will be very poor because they have bad climate, they have no natural resources, and they used to live in luxury.
So he says that basically people will be better off, except for those who live in Moscow. Now, the political power is Moscow, so that's going to be one of the biggest issues. You're telling the people who have the most power and money at the moment, well, if it splits up, it's going to be really bad for you, but great for everybody else. So he basically sees it in terms of, I guess, income redistribution amongst Russians, that, except for the Muscovites, everyone else will probably be better off or pretty much the same.
So that will be a shock for them. But I believe for any other region, it will be for better. And I believe it will be peaceful. Like, think about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Everyone believed it will be terrible. Like, Western Europe didn't want it. Like, only Germans wanted it because of reunification. But Margaret Thatcher was against. The French people were against. Like, all Western Europeans were against it because, oh my God, it will be civil war without end. And there were no.
So that's one of the big concerns about any big country splitting up, is like, will there be lots of war, right? And when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a certain amount of conflict. There was conflict in Moldova, there was armed conflict in Georgia, there was armed conflict as a result in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it's either in that Caucasus area. In Ukraine, there wasn't any war. Belarus, there was a little bit of conflict, I remember, in Central Asia in a few places. Within Russia itself, we had obviously the war in Chechnya. That we had 2 wars in Chechnya as a result, which was an attempt to stop more parts of this Russia breaking away. So should maybe rephrase that. Well, you know, the agreement at the end of the Soviet Union was that it split out into its constituent Soviet socialist republics, but nothing smaller than that. So that's why Russia remains so big, because as a Soviet republic, it was absolutely massive. Those were to be the new national borders of those new independent countries. So you're talking about Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, obviously Ukraine, but not somewhere like Tatarstan or Chechnya or the Komi Republic or anywhere else in Russia or within, or Crimea, for example, in Ukraine. They were expected to stay within those new countries. So there was a certain amount of conflict, but not an enormous amount, I guess, considering what a cataclysmic shock the whole thing was. You're talking about, I mean, Russia's still the biggest country in the world geographically, but the Soviet Union was even bigger. And yeah, relative to what it could have been, I guess the amount of violence was. It was there, but it was limited compared to what it could have become. Would that be repeated if Russia were to split up? Well, I guess a lot of it depends on how it splits up. I mean, if it's going to be a situation where like what happened in Chechnya, where the central Russian government says, no, you can't, and they start fighting a war, well, obviously there's going to be a war. If it's a case like the Soviet Union, when it split out into its separate republics, into independent nations, then they agreed on that, and they didn't start fighting each other that much. Now, you just talk about Armenia and Azerbaijan. That was because, well, the Nagorno-Karabakh, the Soviets had drawn the borders so that some Armenians were in Azerbaijan and some Azeris were in Armenia, and that caused a lot of conflict because those borders were drawn that way. You see it also violence occasionally in Central Asia. Like I remember meeting some refugees. There were like an ethnic group of Turks who had fled, I think it was Uzbekistan in the early 90s because, yeah, the borders were drawn, they were there, and then the local government and the locals didn't want them there. So the Russian republics themselves, unless there are some major issues with respect to how they are drawn that would cause massive conflict, I can't think of any off the top of my head that would be like that. Then that's not likely to be as big an issue. I think, would Moscow agree to all of this if it's likely to lose a lot of its resources and become poor? And yeah, that's to be seen. I'm not so sure. And would it be a reaction that Tatarstan declares independence because Moscow won't agree to it? Then probably got a lot of conflict. So not really convinced, but I guess we can be optimistic that if Russia were to start to disintegrate, or parts of it want to become independent, that they would find some diplomatic agreement to allow that to happen, not have a war.
Like we had like some clashes in Tajikistan, but they started before the end of the Soviet Union, and we had like some wars like Transnistria or Abkhazia or others, but they were all wars where Russia participated. You see the difference? Like Russia remained too big. Russia remained an imperialist player. It was not the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the reduction of Soviet Union to the borders of Russia.
That's an interesting observation he makes, that where there was most of the conflict was because, well, Russia still projects itself as an imperial power. And obviously we see that in Ukraine today, where they have this imperialistic war against Ukraine. It's imperialistic because 2 days before they invaded, in that speech, Putin said that, he started off like, Ukraine doesn't have a right to be independent of Russia's sphere of influence. I think the word he used was inalienable. And its current borders are illegitimate, right? So I'm saying, you don't have a right to be independent of us, and your borders are not real. So we're going to change them. And yeah, if Moscow in this scenario were to take the same attitude, then yeah, it's going to be that kind of Chechnya scenario, almost certainly, if they still see this. So I guess it comes down to, and the problem is that, like, he's given this outline where a few republics would want to splinter first, Russia's still going to be this massive country. So the question is Moscow going to let those places go peacefully? I can't imagine it, obviously, with the current government. If they were to ask nicely, not thinking that a president of Russia who is now on a messianic mission in his mind to unite all of Russia's possessions from the former imperial times that they once had owned or controlled, that he's suddenly going to be fine with other parts of Russia splitting. And these republics and other regions have continuously lost power or any sort of like autonomy, real autonomy, in the last 30 years since Russia became independent. So what do I think overall? You should go and watch the full video to get better idea of all the little details about the different, the various regions in Russia and what he foresees happening. Well, he has these three conditions that he outlines about, well, definitely the gerontocracy part, about being basically ruled by old people. Yeah, that's probably seems to be the case visually and looking at the leadership, top leadership in Russia. Economic problems, definitely Russia's had them. Are they going to be severe and crippling as they were for the Soviet Union? Potentially. We just have to see what happens, especially in light of this invasion, the amount of economic sanctions, and going forward, whether Russia's economy really takes a very hard hit. And then the obvious one is the analogy between the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and Russia's current invasions, or latest invasion of Ukraine, which has definitely had a very big effect in terms of, and a very similar loss of life already within, I'm speaking in day 100. So yeah, it's absolutely insane number of deaths. Now, is that the same, that short, intense war where obviously information is controlled? He says information will get out to the different regions, and a lot of these regions that have these resources have ethnic minorities, and they tend to be in the army more, so then it's going to be a lot of their sons of those families there are going to be upset, obviously, if their children have died in this war. Wars tend to become more and more unpopular the longer they go on, rather than a catastrophic loss of life in the beginning of the war. So we just have to see what happens. And I think really vitally does Russia end up having to leave Ukraine and not being able to call it a victory, because that definitely will have a massive effect on the current Russian leadership's ability to stay in power and in control of the country. That would definitely seem to be, if that is the case. And when this war started, and I called it in day 30, I just don't see how Russia can control all of Ukraine being so big, especially with how the war has gone. We're on day 100 and they control 20% of the territory. It's not clear whether they will expand that or they will actually start to lose parts of that 20% going forward, but controlling in some way, either through a puppet government in Kiev, in a rump state, and then annexing other parts of it, whether they can actually control that, it just seems to be very far-fetched. So we just have to see what happens, how much they have to withdraw from, if any. It's always possible that I guess they win, but I think the probability of that is pretty low. And what kind of counter-arguments are there to this? Well, perhaps Putin is able to just tighten his control over the country in spite of everything going around. I mean, look at North Korea. They've had famines, and as of China has a Stalin creative famine, so you can have economic problems like starvation and actually become even more entrenched as a leader. So it's not a given that because there are economic problems or that there are sanctions on the country that's going to result in a loosening of the power being centralized in the state. Could actually just increase it by making people kind of, if you say, I guess, successfully able to frame things to the public as, oh, look, is the West, they're causing all these problems for us because they hate us, they want to keep us down. And people buy into that rather than pointing the finger at the central leadership in Moscow that started this war. Then yeah, maybe he'll be successful at that. Also economically, it's not very clear, what are going to be the long-term effects. Maybe Russia, I mean, their exchange rate is pretty high for the ruble at the moment. I'm not sure what they're doing in the foreign exchange markets to keep it that way. It's a little bit counterintuitive to me that it's higher than it went at any time in the last while. Never mind during this war, that's actually stronger now than it was before the invasion on February 24th. We'll see if that's sustainable in the long run. I'd be very skeptical of that. And finally, I think, yeah, it's very hard to predict what the reaction of Moscow is going to be if there are some regions that push to become independent. I think they might push to have more autonomy back and maybe more distribution of resources towards them if the resources coming out of those regions. I'm not completely convinced they're just suddenly going to go for independence. And there are a lot of oblasts and republics and different regions of Russia itself. It's not as, well, shall we say, nicely divided up into a manageable number of republics like the Soviet Union was, and they just basically all broke out. That was whether they really wanted it or not. I think they all voted for it, right? So they did. Where would those boundaries be? I think that's going to be big potential for conflict as well. And yeah, it's just not very clear to me how it would break up realistically. A few regions might want independence to have a lot of resources and have an ethnic group, like he says, that's separate. And in the majority to Russians, that could definitely happen. And if the Russian government decided it was better to let them secede than to fight like they did in Chechnya, then that could happen. Personally, I'm pretty indifferent to whether Russia breaks up or not as a result of this invasion. What I would like to see is them to leave Ukraine and stop killing tens of thousands of people. And if that means that Russia has to break up into different countries in order to stop being imperialistic and attacking its neighbors, then fine. If it can reform internally and stop being a revanchist empire, then that's also cool with me as well. So that's my video for today, my reaction to whether Russia will collapse in a similar way to the Soviet Union. I think it's probable, in conclusion, that Russia will definitely be smaller than it is now in 5 years' time. We can see in 5 years' time whether it was right or not. On the balance of probability, I think this war has been a catastrophic mistake for Russia. And, you know, in one of my videos, I talked about a difference of a lot of Russians or apathy or inaction, even if they oppose the current war, because yeah, they don't really think it affects them that much because they're not soldiers there in Ukraine, been sent by the Russian government, and maybe they don't go to Ukraine. And you know, I don't want to take any risks of maybe the Russian government. The Russian government is authoritarian and sliding towards totalitarianism at the moment. But they should think about what is their country going to be if it doesn't reform, if it continues to be an empire and fails in that project and that endeavors. And you know, on day 100, I can't say that's going to fail 100%, but I'm pretty sure it will. What is their country going to look like? Are they going to be able to reform and stay together? Or are they going to basically disintegrate in a similar way to the Soviet Union? And that will have a lot of effects, not just civil war potentially. We got the loose nukes that he kind of dismissed because that was one of the big concerns at the end of the Soviet Union. The West didn't push, in spite of what Putin at times has alluded to. Oh, they wanted to split up Russia, destroy us. There was a plan to create 4 different countries. But the West didn't push. It didn't recognize Chechnya, for example, when it pushed that. Well, it declared itself independent. And the reason for that is not because the West is benign. It's because, well, they were worried about loose nukes and making sure the nuclear weapons didn't end up in some random warlord's hands, because they might use them and start a World War III. And there was just going to be a lot of effects of, you know, potential civil wars within Russia as well, which they had seen a bit in the other Soviet republics that had become independent, like Moldova or Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. And that obviously creates a lot of problems like refugees, like we've seen in Ukraine. We have I think it's some crazy number of internally displaced people. Is already I think 14 or 15 million, and refugees who've left the country to go primarily to the European Union is I don't know if it's 6-7 million at this stage. These are massive figures, and of course, if coming from Russia, which is a country a lot bigger, it's also going to be massive. So all those things are going to be big issues if it happens. Loose nukes is terrifying because obviously that could mean that, yeah, just an absolutely horrific end to the planet if things are getting fired off by some, you know, non-state rogue, a rogue state actor or a non-state actor that takes possession of them. So I think his prediction in terms of the consequences is a little bit too rosy, that basically all Russians will be better off except for those that live in Moscow. Whenever you have such a pivotal event in world history, which is the collapse of a big power that could break up into, massive amount of fighting. You could say even that this war in Ukraine is, a continuation of that process of the collapse of the Soviet Union, where Russia has retrospectively just decided it doesn't respect that agreement was made in 1991 to dissolve, and that the different republics would become independent states. Now Russia is again, as he was rightly pointing out, the main source of all the conflict in the former Soviet Union, because it still sees itself as an imperialistic power, and it still has a leadership, at least, that thinks that that's the way the world should be. And if that continues, definitely we're going to have a lot of problems. So do I think it will happen? Yeah, I think probably on the bounds of probabilities, yes, because I think this invasion was such a catastrophic mistake. And I think it will probably even surpass the mistake the Soviets made in invading Afghanistan. Is it certain? Of course not. I don't have a crystal ball. Just think that the probability is pretty damn high. So that's my video from today. Drop a comment down below what you think. Will Russia implode like the Soviet Union? Will it change in terms of its structure? Maybe it will reform. Maybe it will break up into different countries. Maybe it will start to acquire lots more territory again and end up bigger again. Although I think that's not looking extremely likely in light of this train wreck of an invasion. So on day 100 of Ukrainian resistance to the latest invasion by Russia, Slava Ukraini, Herom Slava, and I will see you in the next video. Do побачення, до свидання, хороший вечір.
SAR Experience.